Yeah, that's almost perfect.
One, two, hey, hey, yep, check, check. Lectern, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, hey, hey, yep. Testing lectern. 1, 2, 3, how you going there, James? Sorry? Right, I got these cats away. Thank you so much.
Check 1, 2, 2, 2, check, check. Check handheld microphone. Test 1, 2, check.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
guys getting absolutely decapitated with these. It's a huge health and safety.
your host from Radio 2GB Network 10, Current Affairs commentator, Mr. Steve Price.
Good morning, everyone. How fantastic is it to be back in Canberra? We had an exciting budget last night. When we've all finished here, we can head off down to the High Court, see what happens to Katie Gallagher. We might have a bunch of by-elections before we know it. We're going to have a very interesting morning. I note that the Daily Telegraph this morning has Treasurer Scott Morrison portrayed as someone I'm not sure he ever thought he would be, and that is Angus from AC/DC. On the front page, holding a guitar, back in the black. And the Australian newspaper this morning is also supportive of the budget. So we've got some special guests with us, and we'll see what their sales pitch will be. And we have a couple of hard-hitting journos here to ask some interesting questions. Canberra's a wonderful place. I went outside last night to head back to the hotel and shared a taxi with the former New South Wales Premier Mike Baird, which was interesting given when he was Premier. I think Mike Baird was Premier for 3 or 4 years. Not once did he agree to come on the radio program, but he was happy for me to pay for his cab back to the Realm Hotel in Canberra last night. He's now a banker, so he probably didn't have enough to pay for the cab fare, although given the speculation about Mike's future salary, once that Royal Commission finishes, maybe I should have got him to pay. Sales jobs on. We've had the Prime Minister and the Treasurer out the front on the lawns this morning selling the government's message. They'll be all over radio and television as we have come to see each year after a budget. Interestingly, the radio network that I work on, Macquarie Radio Network, which is right around the country, I'm on 56 stations. We've got the #1 breakfast show in Sydney and Brisbane, #1 morning show, Sydney and Brisbane, but the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, or the Treasurer, Scott Morrison, both reluctant to appear on either program, which is a bit sad, really, because this budget, you need to get out there and sell it, and if they don't want to go where the audience is, they're not going to be able to sell it. I'd like to just go through some of the logistics of this morning. I should mention that the hashtag, we've got very modern here. The hashtag, we're on Twitter. It is FBB2018. So if you want to get on Twitter and let everyone know what's happening. And we're also live streaming this on YouTube. So there are a bunch of people around the world sitting in watching us having our breakfast in Canberra. So that hashtag again is FBB2018. We have two special guests with us. You'll hear from both of those this morning. The Honourable Michael Sukkar, who is the Assistant Minister for the Treasurer, to the Treasurer I should say, and the Honourable Dr Andrew Lee, who is the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, who's also with us this morning. And he turned up on time this year. Well done, Andrew. Thank you very much. And on my left I have Michael Packey from Macquarie Radio Network, who's our Canberra Bureau Chief, and Emma Alberici from the ABC, who are going to get stuck into our two politicians about last night's budget document. We are here courtesy of the Institute of Public Accountants, our main host. The IPA is the peak accounting body, services the needs of about 35,000 members here in Australia and in 80 other countries right around the world. The IPA, I think very importantly, is an active voice in the small business sector here in Australia. And we know there was some small business announcements in the budget last night that are good news for small business. They have partnered up with Deakin University, and they launched the first ever Australian small business white paper. That was in 2015, and I know they're doing some policy work on another of those, and their commitment to small business continues. We'll see some more news on that and a new white paper coming out shortly. We are always happy to welcome our Canberra Business Chamber. This has become my favourite city in Australia, outside Sydney and Melbourne. No, I'm serious. My daughter's studying at ANU and I spend quite a bit of time here now, and I'm really excited because I'm back here on Saturday for Parents' Weekend. There's going to be a top temperature of 7 and it's going to be raining. and she's playing in an AFL game, so I'll be standing on the sidelines. How much fun's that going to be? But the Canberra Bureau Business Chamber are fabulous hosts of this event. They are the leading business organisation in the Canberra region. They call on government and all political parties to work on their Destination 2030 vision for Canberra, to follow their roadmap and implement change to support the long-term economic success of this region. And what a region it is when you visit some of these wineries and some of the places around Canberra. It's fantastic. I note the number 30 is carved into the lawn outside Parliament House, and I learnt last night when I got back and turned the TV on that that's because this Parliament building is 30 years old, which we call it the new Parliament House. It's hardly new anymore. Our major event sponsor this morning are the Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand, professional body comprising of 117,000 diverse, talented and financially astute members who utilise their skills every day to make a difference right around the world. The members are known for their professional integrity, principled judgment, their financial discipline, and we look forward to their forward-looking approach to business, which of course contributes to the prosperity of everybody. So thank you to our sponsors, thank you to our hosts. Let's get stuck into it. We're going to give our politicians around 10 minutes each to give us their version of what happened in this House last night. Well, I'd like to call on the Honourable Michael Sukkar first, the Assistant to the Treasurer, to tell us how the government is going to get itself re-elected.
Thanks, Steve. Well, thanks so much, Steve. Appreciate the introduction. Good morning, everybody. Can I first start by thanking the Canberra Business Chamber and the Institute of Public Accountants for putting on this event, which seems to get bigger every year, and can I particularly acknowledge Andrew Conway from the IPA, an old friend and someone who does great work on behalf of his members. Michael, Emma, great to be with you too. Go easy on us a bit later on. As you all saw last night in the Treasurer's speech and the subsequent commentary, our view is that Australians ultimately want to know how the government intends to spend their hard-earned money. And most importantly, as you all know, what's in it for them, what's in it for their paycheck, and ultimately what's in it for their family. These are, of course, entirely reasonable questions. These are the things that we will focus on over coming days. And I think, as the Treasurer outlined, there is 5 things that we are adamant that this budget and indeed future Turnbull government budgets must stick to. And that's strengthening the economy, obviously. Importantly, and I'll speak in more detail, providing tax relief, particularly in relation to the ever-growing reliance we have on personal income tax, backing business, backing the people who take risks, the entrepreneurs, the small and medium family enterprises who create so many of the jobs that we're seeing created in our economy now and want to see into the future. Of course, making the necessary investments relevant for many of you in Canberra in keeping Australians safe, and importantly, and I think something that's going to be a big part of the lead up to the next election, governments living within their means. Just as your members, your businesses, your clients, your customers must do, governments as well have to live within their means. Firstly, providing tax relief, as you all know, is really the centrepiece of the budget. And if you look at Australia in comparison to most other comparable countries, most notably those in the OECD, we have a significantly higher reliance on personal income taxes. That's why we think that mix needs to change, that personal income taxes need to be reduced, because we want to reward those who take a risk, who work a bit harder, and encourage them to get ahead. And we've done it in a way that's sober, that's sensible, that ensures the fiscal strategy of the government continues to be met, but in a way that's going to encourage those things. The government, as you know, has a 7-year personal tax plan, essentially to make income tax lower, of course, to make it simpler, and always with a progressive tax system fairer. Now, our approach is threefold. Step one of the plan, which is to provide low and middle income earners a tax offset, essentially of up to $530 a year. So for a family with a couple who are both working, over $1,000 a year in relief immediately. We think in an environment with relatively slow wages growth, it was very important to give low and middle income earners and their families that shot in the arm immediately. Indeed, about 4.4 million Australians will receive the full $530 benefit immediately, and up to 10 million Australians will receive some benefit along the way through that tax offset. So that's an immediate shot in the arm for those families and individuals with a personal income tax reduction. Then importantly, in the medium term, again, within a responsible construct, we want to ensure that we finally deal with bracket creep in a more systemic way. And we will be, in future years from 22, 23, and then later on, ultimately ensuring that our tax scales move up to ensure that fewer people get into the middle or highest tax bracket. That's step two of the plan. Step three, which is, I think, a bit of the showstopper of the entire 7-year plan, is that we entirely remove, through increasing the threshold in the middle tax bracket, we essentially lose the 37% tax threshold, which essentially will mean 94% of Australians will fall within the 32.5% tax bracket. Now, that means for the vast bulk of those people, taking on a second job, doing a few extra hours, getting an unexpected pay rise or promotion at work is not going to push them into the highest tax bracket at 45%. We think that's extraordinarily important for those 94% of Australians, and for the vast bulk of them, they will never ever face a personal tax rate above 32.5%. We also want to back business who invest and create the jobs. Now, I know we're in an environment where there's a lot of bashing of business that goes on. There's, I think rightly, some scepticism, particularly with some very, very large corporates, but we know that the 1,000 jobs that are being created today are largely being created by small and medium enterprises who have benefited from our previous tax cuts, and we want to continue to support them. The instant asset write-off of $20,000 continues unabated. That's always something that's very popular amongst small businesses. And importantly, infrastructure spending, and I say this as a very parochial and proud Victorian, is something that this government is taking a much more interventionist and substantial approach in. If you look at my home state, $5 billion for an airport rail link, $1.75 billion for the North East Link, $3 billion for the East West Link, a mix of road and rail projects throughout the country, both passenger, freight, and of course our road network. And that's a $24.5 billion package. And my good friend Greg Hunt, another quite significant investment in this year's budget, the $500 million investment through the Medical Research Future Fund. So these are investments that are, again, within the construct of a government that in the last 6 budget updates, or MyEFO, have met or exceeded our targets. And that's the message I want to leave with you today. We come back to a broad budget balance a year early, in 1920. That's not necessarily significant of itself. Yes, a lot will be spoken about it. I think you saw the Treasurer didn't want to build it up too much last night, as I think former Treasurers have made in the past. But I think the significance of last night's early return to surplus is that we actually now have a government that has a sober and sensible approach to these forecasts, who, touch wood, thus far have exceeded those forecasts. We've not seen revenue write-downs, we've not seen increased budget deficits. Indeed, we are meeting or exceeding every forecast. And in this year's budget, in returning to surplus a year early, I can assure you, all of our projections, everything that underlies that are sober assessments of where the economy is going, sober assessments of the workforce and workforce participation, and is believable. So the message for all of you today is we want Australians to keep more of their hard-earned money. We want them to aspire to do more. We know that a dollar in their hands is better spent than a dollar in the government's hands. And can I say, that's why we are putting in place, and we'll be speaking a lot about our 23.9 tax to GDP ratio rule that we are building into the budget. Because if you don't constrain government spending, if you don't impose that discipline on governments, we've seen around the world what occurs. You have tax and spend, which in the end constrains the economy. So, Steve, I can see you want me to wrap it up. Thank you for your time this morning. I look forward to answering any questions, but this budget is about backing hard-working Australians and letting them ultimately keep more of their own money. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. That Twitter handle again is #FBB2018. I think it was the former Treasurer Peter Costello, and I know Michael won't want me to remind anyone about this, on the ABC the other night said that he thinks that he'd be dead and Lee Sales would be dead before the debt's retired. I reckon I'll be dead before that train gets to the Tullamarine Airport, by the way. And here's a fun fact for you. 2024 is when the final tax cut kicks in. I thought that 2024, that must be an Olympic year. So I looked it up. Here's a fun fact for you. It's in Paris, the 2024 Olympics, if anyone's interested. So when you finally get your tax cut, you'll be able to head off to Paris to the Olympic Games, which will be fun for all of us. The Honourable Dr. Andrew Lee is, of course, the Shadow Assistant Treasurer. He was with us last year. He's here again, and I'd welcome him up to the microphone.
Well, thanks, Steve, and it's great to be back. Can I, of course, begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respect to elders past and present. I know many of you are Canberrans. For those of you who aren't, welcome to the best city in Australia, as certified, Steve, by the OECD. Can I acknowledge our hosts, the Institute of Public Accountants, Canberra Business Chamber, and Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand, and all of you for being here to engage in this important conversation about where the Australian economy is headed and the policies we need to get us to the right place. I want to start, as I have in previous years, by talking a little bit about the broad context in which this budget is being handed down. We've seen the IMF upgrading growth forecasts for 2/3 of the world's economies. Chris Richardson commented ahead of the budget that the rivers of gold are flowing again. That it is raining revenue on the budget, and that's largely as a result of the upgrades to the world economy. But at the same time, we have significant local and global risks. Locally, you worry about the fact that the household debt to income ratio is the highest that it's ever been. And globally, we've just had the announcement this morning that President Trump is pulling the United States out of the Iran nuclear deal. Another reminder that while growth forecasts have been upgraded, fragility remains in the system. In terms of the government's budget, we've seen net debt double over the course of this government, and the talk of debt and deficit disasters, the debt trucks that were so readily to be seen when Prime Minister Turnbull was then opposition leader, seem to have all but vanished. What should a good budget do in that context? Well, it should address productivity, the engine of growth for the Australian economy. It should look to reduce risks, ensuring that our housing market isn't so fragile, and making sure that Australians, as they're going about their day-to-day lives, aren't subject to the vicissitudes of the global economy any more than necessary. Of course, it needs to tackle fairness. Inequality in Australia is now at a 75-year high, and any budget that doesn't recognise that the gap between rich and poor has grown markedly over the last decade has its head in the sand about a fundamental economic issue that has attracted the attention of everyone from the IMF to the OECD to central banks. I've always commented in the past about what I like about a budget, because I think one of the dangers of opposition is you just end up carping about the things you dislike. And I do want to commend the government for what they've done on some modest reforms to superannuation, ensuring, for example, that for young people, insurance is opt-in. In terms of the first set of tax cuts, we've said we will back those first tranche. It's interesting to see the shift from a Treasurer that was saying that poor people don't drive cars to a Treasurer that's now saying that we're going to give you a tax cut that allows you to help fill up the petrol tank. It's good to see the government moving on that, but this is, at its best, simply a tax cut that will make up for a 1% difference in wage growth, when wage growth has been several percentage points lower over the recent years than it has been historically. Many Australians will feel that the tax cuts simply don't give them back what they've lost in sluggish wages. And certainly for somebody who's copping a $77 penalty rate cut to their wages, the tax cuts aren't going to make that back. As to the longer run tax cuts, well, you'd have to re-elect Malcolm Turnbull twice in order to see the benefits of those. So we'll certainly hold back from any signing on to those later round tax cuts. The surplus, such as it is as wafer thin as you can get. I was pleased Michael said before that he wasn't hanging his hat on it too strongly, because 0.1% of GDP is minuscule. As Emma Alberici has noted, as Richard Holden has noted, something as simple as the change in timing of tobacco excise can make or break a surplus of that scale. But we've still got considerable cuts to schools, which the experts of the Australian Economic Society say is a better way of driving economic productivity. Investing in schools, that is a better way of driving economic productivity than delivering company tax cuts. We've seen in the United States the first round effects of the big business company tax cuts have been to go to share buybacks rather than wage increases, a point that even Republican Marco Rubio has recently made. We've got cuts to the ABC, we've got cuts again to overseas aid. We've got the $14 a fortnight cut to the pensioner energy supplement, and the attempt to move our pension age to 70, which would make it the highest in the advanced world. And the budget doesn't tackle a set of tax loopholes that economists across the spectrum have identified. There's a debt deduction loophole that allows billion-dollar multinational firms to shift their profits offshore. Labor identified it 3 years ago, but this budget still doesn't close that loophole. We've had everyone from the Financial Stability Review to outgoing Treasurer Joe Hockey to economists across the political spectrum saying our combination of the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing is acting not only to drive home ownership down to its lowest level in 60 years, but also to create risk in the system. And so tackling those tax concessions will be a fundamental priority for a shortened Labor government. We have a system now where trust distributions are being used to create a two-class tax system. And Labor would address trust distributions to mature age beneficiaries in the same spirit that then Treasurer Howard in the early 1980s addressed trust distributions to young Australians. And we'd close the tax loophole that sees cash refundability of franked dividends, something that only Australia does. And when you're the only country in the advanced world with a particular tax loophole, you do need to ask yourself, is this sustainable? Is this something we can continue to do? Because most tax deductions are not refundable. This one is a particular exemption. So, with the exception of pensioners, Labor would close it. Many of you are from Canberra, so it'd be remiss of me not to close with a couple of remarks as to how the budget particularly affects Canberra. We've got national institutions such as the National Library and the National Archives losing staff. Parking will cost more in the parliamentary triangle. And we've seen over the course of the Abbott and Turnbull governments, not the 12,000 public service jobs that they said would go, but 14,044 public service jobs gone. That's almost a literal decimation of the federal public service. To realise how radical that is, in the Republican primaries a couple of years back, it was only Rand Paul, the most extreme candidate, who said that he would decimate the US public service. But that's what the Abbott and Turnbull governments have done to our public service. And you see it now in people having to work harder, in services being debilitated, problems with the tax office website, problems with the census, problems with people waiting longer than ever on hold to get help from Centrelink. In terms of infrastructure, Canberra again gets significantly less than our fair share. And in terms of pork barrelling of public service jobs, it continues apace, with the Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority still being set to move to Armidale at a cost to the federal budget and a cost to the approval processes for those critical veterinary medicines that every cat and dog owner in Australia relies on. It's pork barrelling, pure and simple. As Robin Hendry has noted, the exodus of agencies out of Canberra has to stop. So this is my third or fourth time, I've just about lost track of addressing this gathering. I very much look forward to being back next year. My only hope, Steve, is that next year I might be moved one spot up the pecking order and talking to you about the priorities of a Labor government being delivered by Chris Bowen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We're going to get to the fun part of the morning now. We're going to do some questions. I'd just like to recognise some of our other sponsors. Without the sponsorship, this event doesn't take place. I would like to thank, this is 13 years service to the Canberra market, Keith Cantley and the Cantley team, trusted executive recruitment partner, key contributor to this region. Lendlease is a sponsor of ours this morning as well, one of Australia's top construction companies. And of course, we're going to talk a lot in a moment about infrastructure. Lendlease has been in the Canberra market now for more than 60 years. Ord Minnett is also a sponsor of this event this morning, Australia's leading financial advisory and stockbroking firm. 11 offices right around the country, including right here in Canberra. Ord Minnett holds $33 billion of Australian investors' money under advice, and Care Super. They've been helping members save for a secure future for over 30 years. Can I thank all of those sponsors? Can you put your hands together for those sponsors this morning? Our event is also supported by the Australian Institute of Company Directors, the Institute of Managers and Leaders, and the Southern Region Business Enterprise Centre. Thank you to all of you. We have Emma Alberici and Michael Packey with us. We're going to get stuck into some questions both for Michael and Andrew, and then importantly, as we've done in previous years, we're going to attempt to throw some questions open to you, the audience. So I know that everybody always enjoys that aspect of what we do. So if you want to put your hand up, we'll get a microphone to you and you can grill our two politicians as well. We'll start with you, Emma. You've been sitting there very patiently. I know you and I left the building at the same time last night, very late, so we haven't had much sleep. Get stuck in.
Thank you. Michael, the Reserve Bank Governor Phil Lowe says that we'll start to see wages grow in a significant manner, that is more than 3% a year when we get to full employment, which he sees at 5%. This budget sees wages growth of 3.5% in 2020-21, and yet doesn't see us go to full employment until 21-22. So you know something the Reserve Bank Governor doesn't know?
Well, Emma, the reality is, and I touched on this in my remarks, a range of factors underpin ultimately the projections that we receive from Treasury on the budget. And I would just point to broadly, before I touch on the specific question, that if you look at Treasurer Morrison's track record, we have not overestimated those things in our favour in a budgetary perspective. Indeed, we've been very sober in the approach we've taken, not just on wages, but GDP and a whole lot of other factors that in the end affect the budget. And that's why we've been able to exceed, not just meet, but exceed MyEFO, the numbers in MyEFO and previously for 6 budget and MyEFO updates. So this is not a treasurer or an assistant treasurer who overpromises and underdelivers. On the remarks around, specifically around wages growth, again, we take the best advice we can from Treasury. If you look at some of the economists, very respected international bodies in projections on GDP, again, I think we've been very sober in the approach we've taken in the forward estimates. So Emma, I can understand the question. I don't dispute that there's always potentially a disparity between this economist or that economist or Philip Lowe in this case.
Can you give us one economist that I haven't seen a single economist in any newspaper or coverage last night or this morning that agrees with you?
The point is, though, that I'm making, Emma, if
you just said a bunch of economists have said this. Can you just give us one?
No. I'm saying a bunch of economists will have different views on almost every factor that's built into the budget. Now, wages is one part of that. It's not the entire part. Yes, it's a significant part because, as I pointed out in my remarks, personal income tax is a disproportionately large part of our budget. But I think if you look in totality at the projections that we've put forward, they're very sober, they're very measured, and again, Emma, without trying to give you a politician's answer that skirts around the question, in totality, we're talking about a government that's delivered and exceeded on the last 6 budgets, MyEFOs and budget updates. This is not, I don't think you can easily accuse us of over-egging the pudding on these things.
Will you split that package up? I mean, you've got tax cuts spread over 7 years. You split up the company tax reforms. Aren't you simply going to do the same thing?
Well, no. I mean, the Treasurer and the Finance Minister have been very clear here. I mean, this is a package to deal with immediate needs that are responsible within the context of the budget, dealing with bracket creep into the future and, again, ensuring that we have a simpler...
So it's all or nothing?
System. Absolutely. I mean, we will be introducing it imminently. If you believe that low and middle income Australians deserve a tax cut, and I think that's something that all governments should aspire to, then I don't know how you can vote for one part but not the other. Andrew
Lee, will you vote for the whole package?
Well, we're not going to sign up for a package which goes so far off into the future. I mean, this is a real sort of do what I say or the kitten gets it kind of approach. The fact is that the short-term tax cuts appear to be sustainable. They appear to be focused mostly in Middle Australia, but you simply can't say that for the later phase of the tax cuts.
Well, can I just jump in? I mean, the reality is here, Andrew remarked that you'd need to re-elect the government twice. That's completely false. I mean, we can pass this legislation that locks in these personal income tax reductions this year, immediately. It doesn't rely on the re-election of a Turnbull government, and it would be a very important statement from this parliament that we think that low and middle income earners deserve some tax relief. And again, no one can dispute our disproportionate reliance on personal income tax, and in the end, that acts as a handbrake on the economy and aspiration.
So I'll go to Michael next, but Andrew, I mean, that means you're going to stand up and argue that Australians shouldn't get a tax cut at the lower end. That's going to be very difficult for you, isn't it?
No, that's simply not right. I mean, we are happy to support the first round effect of these tax cuts.
But that's not what's being offered to you.
But the government has split up previous packages, as you've noted. I would also just make one more point. I mean, if Michael's chief concern is that we're over-reliant on personal income taxes, it does seem strange you would have an $80 billion company tax cut. So that's simply, as a proportionate effect, increases our reliance on personal income taxes.
And can I just pick up on that point too, because Michael, I heard you say that too, about this disproportionate reliance on income taxes, which is very true when you look around the world, but comparable countries have across the OECD, the average consumption tax, GST, is 19%.
Yeah.
And ours is still at 10%. So if you want to talk about proportionality, is your government intending to do something about the GST then?
You're right, Emma. I mean, the reality is for a lot of those comparable nations, indirect taxes are much higher, but that's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm saying, and I'm making the self-evident point, we have an over-reliance on personal income tax which affects everyday salary and wage earners, and it's therefore absolutely necessary and proper that our government and the parliament indeed, this should be bipartisan, strive at every opportunity to reduce that. Now, we're not going to be able to reshape it overnight. We're not going to be able to reshape it in one budget. But over time, I think we need to be doing everything we can to make personal income taxes lower,
but you
simpler
didn't answer
and
my
fairer,
question
to
about
use
the
phrase.
GST.
No, I answered your question very clearly. There's no way that we're going to reshape our reliance on personal income tax by increasing the GST, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing everything we can to reduce that reliance by reducing personal income taxes. That's what this does, and I'm not sure how the Labor Party can vote against, for example, step 2 of our personal income tax plan, which increases the 19% threshold from $37,000 to $41,000. I mean, they're not high-income earners.
Michael?
Andrew, just on the tax cuts, given that we're just on this topic, what is wrong with getting rid of a tax bracket and having that flat rate of 32.5% for people on $41,000 or $200,000?
Michael, I think it goes to one of the points I made in the opening, which is the significant uncertainty around where the world economy is going to be in 2024. That is, 2 Malcolm Turnbull victories away, and Michael's ideal view of the world. It's a very long time away.
But just on the issue, but just on the whole, if someone on $40,000 is paying 32.5% in tax, and someone on $200,000 is also paying the same, won't it encourage that person on $40,000 to aspire to get more money or to get a promotion or whatever, because they know they're not going to pay any extra in tax?
So your question basically goes to why we have a progressive income tax system, and that's to do with people's capacity to pay. My ability to pay to contribute to public services, as somebody whose income places them in the top couple of % of the Australian income distribution, is markedly greater than that of a young apprentice who's just gotten a job. I should pay not just a higher dollar amount of tax, but a higher rate of tax, because I can afford to do that. That's fundamental fairness, and the package that is proposed unambiguously would make Australia's tax system less progressive at a time when inequality is at a 75-year high, when wages have grown 3 times as fast for the top 10th as for the bottom 10th. We'd be flattening the tax scales.
At the moment, Andrew, 3% of taxpayers are in that top bracket that pay above 47%. Your side of politics wants to raise that 47% to 49%, or is it 50%?
Radically, we would have it back to where Tony Abbott had it when he was complaining about debt and
you want to put the
deficits.
budget repair levy back on?
Indeed. We believe it was appropriate at that stage to have a levy on high-income earners.
But is that still your position? So you would take that 47% to 49 or 50?
We still believe that's appropriate, Emma.
Okay, so at the moment there are 3% of taxpayers paying that 47%. In 7 years' time, that'll double. There'll be 6% of taxpayers in that bracket. So you think 6% of taxpayers should have to pay 49 or 50%? Well,
that budget repair levy is about making sure that we actually get the budget back into surplus and end up paying down debt. At a time when debt's doubled, we do believe it's appropriate to have that higher income tax rate at the very top end. I didn't change my work behaviour. My judgment, when I look at the way in which Australians behaved when that top marginal tax rate went up, is that there's very little drag on the economy. And we do worry, as economists, about the disincentive effect of taxes. But at that very top end, I didn't see Tony Abbott's temporary budget repair levy having an impact on work incentives. I don't believe it would do so again. And I certainly think it's fairer than taking $1 a day away from pensioners in the form of the energy supplement.
Michael, there's a large part of the budget is devoted to reforms in aged care. One of the interesting aspects of this is this idea that some pensioners would be able, if they're on the full pension, to borrow 150% of that pension to enable them to stay in their own houses as opposed to go into aged care. Isn't that the government getting into the business of reverse mortgages?
Well, Steve, I mean, the reality is, if you look at what we've done in aged care, not just in this budget, but what was announced before Christmas with further aged care packages, I mean, there is, I think, a level of bipartisanship in Australian politics over many years of trying to assist people to remain in their own homes. There's a whole heap of very good social policy reasons for doing that. Strictly speaking, as the Assistant Minister to the Treasurer, there's some very good financial reasons for trying to assist people to stay in their own homes.
So how would it work?
We want to give people those opportunities, and the reality is, if I look at my electorate and look at my constituents, I have a range of quite a large cohort of my constituency who, to use the old phrase, are asset rich and cash poor. They're relying on a pension. They've got a family home that's got a whole lot of embedded equity in it. I think there's nothing wrong with government sensibly trying to assist people to stay in their own homes, provided they've got the ability to make
So explain how it would work.
Free choices. Well, Steve, in essence, it would enable people to borrow an amount to, as you said, up to 150%, to supplement their pension, which we think is sensible given that a large cohort or large group in that cohort of pensioners have quite significant asset balances, and this doesn't supplement, but it in some respects is a further step down the path of the asset threshold changes that we made a couple of years ago, which weren't entirely popular at that time, but in the end, when I look at a room like this and I look at the current generation of income tax payers talking about a heavy reliance on personal income tax, these were decisions that were
Can
tough.
we just come back to that plan though? I was trying to explain this to my 85-year-old mother in the airport yesterday as I was dispatching her back to Adelaide. I couldn't explain it, she didn't understand it. She said, I'm scared about living on my own in the house, I don't really want to be there at night when I'm 90. It sounds like a good idea, but I've had no one in government actually explain how it's going to work.
Well, Steve, there'll be better people more qualified to answer that, including Ken Wyatt or Greg Hunt. The absolute specifics of how
I'm not going to put it on you.
it.
If you don't know how it works, that's fine.
Well, it is quite a complicated process.
Andrew, do you support this idea?
Certainly in principle support the notion that people should be enabled to stay in their home. I do note though that there's no additional money for aged care, so the aged care announcement is being met by unspecified savings within that portfolio, and that's disappointing given the aged care crisis that we have in Australia.
Michael, in this budget, the government has made a fair few spending announcements previously and last night in the lead up to the budget. In the lead up to the budget, you made spending announcements and you confirmed a lot of them last night in the budget papers. How does the government reconcile the spending that it's made with the push to reduce debt and deficit, given that only a couple of years ago the government was talking about a budget emergency, and this is obviously something that Labor seems is going to hone in on in the lead up to an election?
Well, if you look at our approach to spending, I mean, last year's budget was really the point in which we turned the corner from borrowing to fund everyday government expenditure to funding infrastructure, and of course our Prime Minister's taken a much more interventionist approach in how the Commonwealth engages in infrastructure. If you look at the budget we inherited in 2013, obviously we had a slowing economy, we had rising unemployment, we had a deteriorating budget position with growth in expenditure of about 4%. It was reduced to growth in expenditure of 1.9%, now down to 1.6%. That is extraordinarily constrained spending growth, and we're very proud of the tough decisions we've taken to ensure that new expenditure decisions to the greatest extent possible have been met by corresponding offsets in any particular portfolio. But I think if you look at the headline, that expenditure growth now is down to about 1.6%. I mean, that is, that compares to any government almost in the last 40 or 50 years as far as being a very, very impressive rate of growth in spending.
But the public still seems to be worried about debt and deficit. There was, I think, a poll out last week saying they want governments to pay off debt and use some of these surpluses to pay off debt.
And that's exactly what we will be doing. I mean, if you look at the early return to surplus is broadly a budget balance. Now, those of us who are slightly more optimistic about perhaps where the economy will go will hope that that will be larger. Those who will be pessimistic will think it will be around a budget balance. But if you look at then 2021, 21, 22, where you're talking about significant budget surpluses moving...
But net debt is still about $300 billion in those years.
The
interest rates are still about $14 billion.
There's no doubt there will be a big job as we return the budget to surplus of, over the longer term, about 1%
and you're spending
of GDP.
$140 billion on tax cuts.
Well, this is where I think, Michael, language is very important. I don't view allowing those who are on very high marginal rates of tax to keep a bit more of their money as government spending. I think allowing them to keep more of their own money is extraordinarily important to fuel the economy. And again, I think there's a high road and a low road back to surplus. I think the high road is constraining government expenditure, saying we're going to set a speed limit, 23.9% tax to GDP ratio, impose some discipline on government and get there through a growing economy, rather than the alternative approach, which is increasing taxes on ever larger groups in the economy.
It seems like Peter Costello might have been right. We'll all be dead before the debt gets paid off. Emma.
For quite some time now, several years, analysts, economists, the Reserve Bank have been raising the alarm about where our economy is going. We've had a once in 150 year mining investment boom. That's coming off, and the Reserve Bank Governor says we need to transition to something else. Malcolm Turnbull came to government in 2015 as the Prime Minister, trumpeting innovation and saying that was going to be the future for the country. He appointed Bill Ferris, the long-time venture capitalist, very well-respected businessman, to head up the Innovation Science Australia agency to look at this, and he set up a board and did a review that reported to government in November about how we become a more knowledge nation, how we end up with businesses of the future and therefore jobs of the future. That report was released publicly in January, and part of that process in 2016 involved a review of the research and development tax incentive. Bill Ferris, your own advisor, said yes, it wasn't being spent in the way it was intended necessarily, so there was a lot of business as usual going on rather than truly inventive work. He suggested to your government that you revamp the scheme. He didn't suggest you take money out of it. And so at the moment, that report says that Australia ranks 9th out of 11 comparable countries in terms of our expenditure, government and business, on research and development. Bill Ferris, again, said in an interview with me this week and also elsewhere publicly, he points out that our economy is very unsophisticated at the moment, that our top 5 companies, when you compare them on the stock exchange to the top 5 in the US, that is incredibly illuminating. So here we've got, at the moment, CBA, ANZ, Westpac, NAB and BHP, all more than 100 years old. In the US, the top 5 companies are Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, Microsoft and Facebook, all roughly no more than 30 years old. And then on another score, I will get to my question, but
It's the world's longest question, Emma.
on another score, well, I read the report, and it's really interesting that the government responded by taking money out of research and development, because on another score, Harvard and MIT rank economies on their complexity and on how knowledge-based they are. Australia ranks last in the OECD, and we rank around 70th near Oman and Kyrgyzstan as far as sophisticated economies go. So here's my question. How are both of you going to address that? Because given we've been so blessed by natural resources, wool, iron ore, coal, and the Governor of the Reserve Bank sounds the alarm and says, we can't be complacent anymore. Where are the jobs going to come from in the future, to both of you?
Well, Emma, can I just say, just in relation to the commencement of your remarks, this idea that the budget's improved, built on the budget improvement's been built on the back of commodity prices or the mining investment is clearly not the case, and I'm not saying you're suggesting that, but some have. Some have suggested that there's rivers of gold coming in that's just lucky. The reality is our economy in recent years has diversified as we've tailed off from the mining investment boom, and the growth, 1,000 jobs a day, really solid receipts to government has come at a time when we've really been transitioning away from that mining investment boom. So that, I think, gives us some optimism. As far as
so are you saying it's not a result in your own budget papers yesterday, you say that $25.9 billion is how much extra revenue comes in aside from policy decisions?
Yeah, sure, but it's not all based on commodity price increases, or certainly not.
It's improving global economy.
Well, the improving global economy enabled by decisions taken by this government as well. I mean, our tax cuts for small and medium businesses, I think, has been certainly fueled jobs growth, which in the end flows through to the bottom line of the budget, seeing over 400,000 jobs being created. So that was just my preamble, that I don't think we should say that somehow the improvement in the budget's just been this stroke of great luck. You're right, I think looking at the R&D tax concession, it did seem clear that a lot of claims were based on business as usual activities of many in corporate Australia. Our view is, though, probably the area of our greatest advantage, and one area that we're, I think, ahead of the curve on, is medical research. Hence the $500 million investment for the Medical Research Future Fund into genome research and commercialisation, hopefully, of that work. Also, the Treasurer and I have, it doesn't go remarked very often. It certainly doesn't make the media very often, but we've worked very closely with our fintechs. I mean, this is an area where we do have a relative advantage. If you look at the States, the UK, we're sort of up there in the top 4 or 5, and that's where so much of this work's happening. So I think in the end it won't be driven by government. We'll create the settings, but biotech, medical research, these are the areas, I think, Emma, in the end, that our natural advantage sits.
Emma, I think it's a great question. I gave a speech a couple of months back on that Atlas of Economic Complexity finding, and it's one of the things I worry about as shadow for productivity, that the Australian economy is too simple, that we have too many eggs in too few baskets. Part of the answer to that is making sure we get the R&D piece right. We'll consult with business around the R&D announcements in the budget and get their views on those. But clearly,
sorry to interrupt. When you introduced the R&D tax concession, the Gillard government introduced it. It was expected to cost the budget $1.8 billion a year. It's now costing $3 billion a year. Do you accept that it's being rorted?
We'll speak to business about the announcements in the budget, and we're keen to consult on that. We're less than 24 hours down from the budget. But we also need to make sure we're investing more in human capital. That $17 billion that's been ripped out of schools is one of the reasons that we're not going to see a turnaround in our international test scores until we get great teachers in every school. The government has just recapped university places. From the 1st of January this year, no longer can every kid with the smarts to get to university get a place. And that could mean an entire football stadium's worth of kids don't get a place at university. Apprenticeship rates have halved. And then the other platform, I think, towards building complexity is engaging with Asia. Our future Asia policy is around making sure we have better business engagement on trade deals, that they're multilateral deals rather than these sort of bilateral press conferences, that we get more Asia literacy on boards and that we have more Australian kids learning Asian languages. So that complexity piece is a fundamental challenge for the Australian economy at a time when productivity just isn't as good as it should be. National broadband network has got to be at the heart of this too. If we're going to get more innovative start-up businesses, then we actually need those glass cables connecting all the way to the premises rather than stopping somewhere down the street and being connected with old century.
We'll have a riot if you bring up the NBN. Seriously. Questions from the audience, we're going to get to those, so if anyone does have one, just stick your hand up. Just a couple of quick things, Michael, and first of all though, there's a figure in the budget last night about the black economy and how you're going to try and reduce the amount of money disappearing in the black economy. How are you actually going to do that?
Well, we've had a report into the Black Economy Task Force, which has basically looked at the way in which the ATO at the moment, we've got a big team that tries to deal with the black economy, how we're going to do it into the future, and in essence, Steve, we're going to resource the ATO further to go even harder on compliance. The black economy, depending on who you speak to, but best estimates could be up to $30 billion per annum. This is huge leakage in our tax system. As the Treasurer made pretty clear last night, we think that there's hard-won gains there. It's not necessarily low-hanging fruit because we do have compliance activities, but in essence, Steve, we're going to resource the ATO even more because we know for every dollar that we put into the ATO on compliance, you get an exponential dividend out.
Emma?
Just on that point, I made the point yesterday speaking to someone that I recently did a renovation where the builder wants to be paid in cash and you give them $500 here and $1,000 there, and it might amount to $10,000, but they take it in progress payments. That sort of thing will just increase, won't it? And you won't be able to find it necessarily. You're going to go and hunt down everyone who withdraws $500 or $1,000.
Emma, I don't think we're claiming that there's some sort of silver bullet panacea to this, but bit by bit we're just trying to chip away at it, and it's about trying to get as much of that as possible.
Sorry, Andrew. I know Steve wanted me to ask this question because it's the Richard Holden question. He told us yesterday that the reason you reach surplus at 1920 is all down to the timing of this new way of collecting the tobacco excise. Is he right? Is this just a matter of bringing forward by 12 weeks when you collect the tax because you're collecting it at the port rather than somewhere else, and you're only doing that, and the effect of that is only one-off, and in that year, coincidentally, you get a surplus?
Well, no, it hasn't been contrived for that purpose, Emma. I mean, clearly when you've got a relatively small budget surplus projected in any year, inevitably you'll have claims in the media that this decision was the decision that got you over the line, or it was that decision or the other. No decision's been taken to contrive an early return to surplus. But clearly when you've got a thin, we're calling it return to budget balance broadly, there's any number of individual decisions either cumulatively taken in the budget or in previous years that are sort of the difference between where you fall on that dividing line.
Questions from the audience? Please, have we got a microphone? Yep, sorry, we'll get you.
Ross Fox, Catholic Education, Canberra Goulburn. Last year's budget imposed significant new cuts and real cuts on non-government schools, Catholic and independent schools, particularly here in the ACT. There's been some significant spending initiatives in this budget, but no action to address that problem. What's the plan of the government or the alternative government to address this, given families with dependent children, particularly in the ACT, pay a lot of tax and want to access an affordable non-government school as an option for their family and their children?
Let's go alternative first and then government.
Ross, the cuts to schools aren't just hit on families, but they're also hit on our future productivity. If we're going to be a smart nation that competes with the world on high value-added industries, we have to do a better job of educating our kids. Which is why, as I said before, when you do a poll of top economists from the Economic Society of Australia and you say to them, do you believe it would be better for economic growth to put in place a big business tax cut or to properly fund our schools, the vast majority say properly fund our schools. So we're committed to putting back into schools the $17 billion that the government has taken out.
Michael?
Well, Ross, look, as you know, and you know this better than most, you know, our Gonski 2 package, which was just shy of $24 billion, is obviously a significant investment from the federal government into all school sectors. In relation to Catholic and independent schools, as you know, following the passing of that legislation, we've got an SES review which is looking at some of the specific issues associated with Catholic ed and independence in particular. I'm very confident that we'll get to a point where needs-based funding, as endorsed by David Gonski, the man himself, will be finalised, and I'm pretty confident, Ross, that everyone will feel as though they are getting a fair share of that very large additional spend of $24 billion.
Because you don't want the Catholic education system running a campaign against you during an election, do you? That wouldn't be very clever.
We want everyone campaigning for the government, obviously. Yeah.
Yes.
Michael Croker, Chartered Accountants Australia, New Zealand. We thought the Treasurer's rabbit out of a hat last night might have been a digital tax on the revenue streams of largely US tech companies that Emma's listed. Instead, the Treasurer has promised a discussion paper to be released in a few weeks' time. The Brits have gone down a similar path of a discussion paper. The Europeans want such a tax. But things are going a bit wobbly over in the UK and Europe because of fears of blowback from our great and powerful friend, led by a president who is not averse to linking
don't want to interrupt, but let's get a question rather than a speech. Trade and tax is intertwined.
Is that the real fear now, that we can't go too much further down the international tax reform path without upsetting the USA?
Well, Michael, I wouldn't say, I mean, it's fair to say that Treasurer, and he's remarked on this publicly, he wanted a multilateral, some sort of consensus around how we tax new digital economies. It's clearly an area of anxiety for Treasury and governments, and no doubt for Andrew as well. I think Scott took the view after seeing some of that work stagnate on, in a multilateral sense, that we were going to have to probably go it alone a bit more, which then meant we probably had to pause and consult a bit more widely. And that'll be primarily consulting with immediate stakeholders, but there's no doubt that we will have to take into account a range of views, including from our big trading partners. But in the end, we will do everything we need to preserve our tax base, and that includes very, very difficult, digital parts of the economy which are very intangible and IP based, which is very hard to tax.
What are you going to do in this space?
Michael, you've thought very hard about this issue, which fundamentally comes down to the fact that in an old economy world, it was pretty hard to pretend that your production was happening in a different country. Whereas now, in an environment in which the biggest four firms in the world are digital firms, they're able to move their source of production around to different countries and often put them in tax havens. I mentioned before there's a debt deduction loophole which we identified 3 years ago that the government is yet to close, and we've been leading the argument around multinational tax. I think it is a blunt instrument to do as the Europeans are intending to do and put in place a digital firm levy, but they're saying, well, until you manage to sort out a long-term deal, that this is a stopgap. But your point about the linkage of the policies, I think, is a really vital one. Australia's heavily dependent on foreign investment, 5th biggest current account deficit in the world, and if we're to maintain public support for foreign investment, which is fundamental to growing the Australian economy, then Australians have to believe that multinational firms are playing by the same tax rules. So that tax piece is critical to maintaining openness.
Okay, we're going to try and get a couple of extra questions in. You're going to start drinking craft beer now, Michael, given that you've given it a tax break? I thought you were a VB man.
I want to rail against craft beer, so yeah, I'll stick to the more established beers.
There's a gentleman over here who's been waving furiously.
Go.
Tim Benson from Riot Act Digital Regional News. I've decided this year that I'm going to base my judgment on the budget on what is on my plate for breakfast. Now, last year we had a mushroom and spinach, so no pork. This year we've got bacon, we've got pork sausage. I'm pretty sure even the coffee was infused with pork. Is all the pork for Canberra on my plate? Or where's our pork in this budget? Not just the bits that are going to everybody else, but where's our slab of pork?
Well, Michael?
Well, clearly a very parochial Canberra audience. Well, look, obviously we're investing in the Monero and Barton, and I think they've been very welcomed. Senator Seselja, I saw, was out there doing a live video trumpeting that. So, look, this isn't a budget about pork barrelling. We've tried to be very sober in what we do. Yes, there are infrastructure investments, but there are infrastructure investments throughout the country. So, yeah, maybe that is the only pork, what's on your plate, but that's how the Treasurer will want
One
it.
up the back there, please.
Well, hang on, as a fellow, as a Canberran, and as a contributor to the Riot Act, Tim, terrific to have you here. I'm surprised that Michael's referring to your question as being parochial. It seems to me that when Canberra is getting a quarter of its fair share of infrastructure spending, that's just a question of equity. And at a time when the federal government has decimated the public service, it's not unreasonable to say, why would you rip more jobs out of the National Library and the National Archives? Canberrans don't want pork, they just want their fair share of infrastructure funding. At a time when infrastructure funding overall is going down, Parliamentary Budget Office says it'll fall over the decade from 0.4% of GDP to 0.2% of GDP. Even within that shrinkage overall, Canberra's share is shrinking down still further.
They ever going to finish that light rail? God, how long has that been going for?
Yeah, I'm Joy from Mess Connect. I have a simple question for Michael and Andrew. I wanted to know from how is the 2018 budget, are they to support, I think Michael mentioned of supporting small business and startups. How are these, have they set aside some funding to support from proof of concept to scaling for startup to be able to grow? I know that starting a business is not an easy thing, and then there are a lot of challenges, race involved. So what support are made available to the ecosystem within the innovation sector in RACEC, funding made available for, and how accessible are these funding for these small business and startups coming up?
Support for startups.
Well, one of the things that I alluded to a bit earlier, and I spoke about, this is not necessarily a budget measure, but what we're doing to assist fintech startups through the regulatory sandbox, which basically allows them to go out there, set up, try, as you say, proof of concept within an environment that doesn't then require them to meet all of the ordinary regulatory requirements that, for example, a fintech would be required to. That's progressing quite well, and I think that regulatory sandbox as it applies there is something that the government will look at more broadly. But in the end, I mean, our approach is not to say how can we support a startup through some kind of additional grant. It's always about how do we ensure that the macro settings in the economy encourage that entrepreneurialism, encourage that risk taking, and in the end, I think governments get their feet on the sticky paper a bit if they think that they can do it just through one means or another. And I think if you look at, very much taking Emma's point around our economy, I think there are very encouraging signs, particularly in that space.
Andrew?
I agree with Michael's sentiments, but I'm a little less optimistic, having seen the rate at which new businesses are being created fall this decade compared to last. Mergers are through the roof, but the start-up rate in the Australian economy isn't where it should be. When I talk to a lot of local small businesses, they talk about the national broadband network as being a constraint. Pharmacy at Gold Creek had to wait months to get the NBN connected, had to put off their opening just because they couldn't get proper broadband. In terms of incentivising investment, we've announced an Australian investment guarantee, which Victoria University says gets 3 times the bang for the buck that you would get from a corporate tax cut. Obviously, we've backed the small business corporate tax cut, but rather than taking $17 billion out of our schools and giving $17 billion to big banks, we think that an investment guarantee is a smarter and more effective way of encouraging more investment and creating the right incentives for startups.
We're just about out of time. One final one from him.
On this point, Michael, in the last decade there's been 60 reports to government on innovation, and this last one you've pretty much categorically ignored, because Bill Ferris also said further to this question that the comparable countries that are the most innovative, being Germany, Sweden, Israel, the US and China, they have opted for direct grants like the Export Market Development Grant, which last night the Export Council said is underfunded. And your own advisors are telling you to do things like increase spending on the Export Market Development Grant and so on. My question is, why do you bother doing all these reports that you then ignore?
Well, I don't accept that we ignore all of that advice. I mean, the reality is, if you look at particularly medical research, we've been very good at the research component. We're not so good at the commercialisation. I don't think all of that rests with government, and I don't think it can be easily repaired, particularly when you've got a very active and aggressive players out of the United States that are pretty good at headhunting talent and very good at commercialising ideas. Or the Israelis, as you point to, who cut a swathe through a lot of particularly our medical research. I don't think we ignore it. Am I saying that there's not a hell of a lot more we can do? Of course not. But I'm not sure anyone in government can say we've got the magic recipe for how all of a sudden we take that great research and then enable commercialisation, which is the toughest part of that.
We are on a tight time schedule here. Quick one from
Just
Michael,
very quickly,
one more from the floor, and then we'll wrap it up.
Just very quickly, just looking forward, in about 7 months' time, there's the mid-year economic review. Do you think that the forecasts that you've had in this budget are going to last into your mid-year economic review? Would they remain intact, or could they potentially be worse?
Well, Michael, I think I've consistently made the point this morning that I think the Treasurer has a great track record in being very sober in those forecasts and under-promising.
But that mid-year economic review is going to be pretty important leading into an election.
Look, no doubt. And I would just say, in the end, we're all looking in our crystal ball to some extent, with the best advice from Treasury. But again, if you look at our recent form, I think we've been pretty sober in those assessments, and I would expect, Michael, that my EFO this year, and I'd hope, stays to that trajectory of form.
One last one.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. My name is Dan Steiner. I'm a taxpayer and retired and a voter. My question really relates to personal tax, and particularly the discussion about the ability to get more tax by increasing the tax rate. My experience is that as income goes up, those people with increasing incomes are very intelligent to get expert advice, and I would wonder how many people on that 40+% tax rate actually pay 40%. It seems to me that those of us who are on the lower end of the scale, and particularly those who pay the basic rate of 19%, could very well pay a higher proportion of their income than people who are earning $500,000 or more. My suggestion would be, why doesn't everyone who's a taxpayer pay the 19%? And then if you want to apply your deductions to your $500,000 or more or whatever, that you can apply it after you pay the 19%. That puts everyone on an equal footing.
Okay.
And that's something that Dr. Lee was saying
Flat
we have
tax
to do.
question.
Dan, I don't think moving to a flat tax system would create a more equitable society, but you're certainly right about the use of tax loopholes. We've said that we would cap the amount that someone can deduct for managing their tax affairs to a reasonable $3,000. That we'd close loopholes that allow trust distributions to mature age beneficiaries. We said we don't think we should remain the only country in the world that provides cash refundability for franking credits. And we've said that we believe that the combination of the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing is acting not only to create inequity, not only drive young people out of the housing market, but also to create unnecessary fragility in the housing market sector. When I was at Harvard, one of my public finance professors was Martin Feldstein, who was Robert Reagan's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. You don't get much more blue blood Republican than Marty Feldstein, but his strong view is that we ought to be closing tax loopholes because it is both more equitable and more efficient than the alternatives. And that's very much the platform Labor will be taking to the next election, closing unsustainable loopholes as a way of paying for the services we need and getting the budget back into surplus.
Thank you, Andrew.
Well, look, I would just say I don't think we have a horribly rorted tax system as Andrew is essentially alluding to. I think if you look at our tax base, we have an increasingly small number of people paying an exponentially large share of our overall tax collection. And at some point in time, with that diminishing group of taxpayers, something's got to give. And our point is, by providing tax relief to that large swathe in the middle, who to some extent carry the system, that you unleash a whole lot of potential. I don't think, and I agree with Andrew, I don't think in the end that we want flat tax rates. We want flatter tax rates, no doubt, and that's step 3 in our personal tax plan. But we do have a highly progressive tax system. That's not something we're seeking to change. But in the end, you can't ask an increasingly diminishing group of individuals to pay exponentially more tax without it having very adverse consequences for the economy.
Thank you, Michael. As usual, we have run out of time. I'd like to thank again the Institute of Public Accountants as our host and the Canberra Business Chamber. Can you put your hands together for Emma Alberici and Michael Packy? And we should thank, of course, Dr. Andrew Lee and Michael Sukkar for giving up their time this morning as well. Have a great day in Canberra. Have a great weekend in Canberra, and I'll see you back here next year.